Okay, Patty, go ahead when you're ready.
Uh, Judy Bronstein is the University Distinguished Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona. She served as the first and to date only female editor-in-chief of the American Naturalist, the oldest still published scientific journal in the United States. She has a strong interest in the history of science. The subject Dr. Bronstein will address this evening is Binders Full of Women, Female Scientists in the American Naturalist, 1867 through 1917. In this talk, she will look at the women who were publishing in a leading biological journal, the American Naturalist, in the first 50 years of its publication. How did they enter science, and under what conditions were they able to persist, either as professionals or as publishing amateurs? What lessons can we take away for how to increase diversity in science today? Dr. Bronstein?
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've interacted a lot with the Tucson Native Plant Society, and it's really fun to get a chance to talk to all of you. I understand the audio is going to be a little wonky, but hopefully I will have enough information on the slides that you'll be able to follow what I'm talking about. So I've always been interested, being a woman in science, about the experience of women in earlier years. My graduate advisor was a woman, and she told me stories about what it was like for her in the 1960s and 1970s. And I like to look further and further back and think about women's experiences. Here's a photo from 1898 of the Cornell Summer Nature Studies School. And clearly there are families here, there's men, there's women, there's some kids. And I look at these women and I wonder, were these women naturalists? Were they active scientists? Were they the wives of the men who were in this summer school? No information about this photo, who these people were. And it always gets me to thinking about the experiences of the women that are so often overlooked in the history of science. Now, there's actually huge interest at the moment at really early women in science. And there are biographies and there are novels and there's wonderful stories about all of these women on this slide and a very small handful of others. They're not the women I'm talking about today, nor, as fascinating a subject as it is, am I going to be talking today about the natural history experts, mostly botanists in our own region. Hopefully you've had Wynn Brown from Tucson come and talk to you about her new biography about Sarah Lemon, one of the real pioneering botanists in the West. And of course, the namesake of Mount Lemmon in Tucson. This is Effie Spalding, who pioneered the study of saguaros and worked on at Tumamoc Hill in Tucson. This is a botany class at ASU in 1903. Look at all these women, right? They were being trained in the natural history of our region. They're not the ones I'm going to be talking about today either. These are the women who I'm going to be focusing on. It's the women who are represented in photos like this. The University of Chicago Botany Department class doing a field trip at Yellowstone in 1923. Here's a geology trip from Mount Holyoke, of course, a women's college. I love the fact that they're all wearing their mortar boards there. Invertebrate biology class at Woods Hole in Massachusetts in 1900. And these are the women I'm particularly intrigued about. The ones who were trying to get a higher education in order to become or to do more science, okay? And the way I'm going to do it today, I'm going to look at women's experience in science through the lens of the American Naturalist, the oldest active American journal of science, founded in 1867. I did this project as I was on the way out the door from being the editor-in-chief of this journal for 3 years. And I published this work with Dan Bolnick, who was coming in as the new editor. So let me tell you a little bit about the American Naturalist and what it covers. This is a beautiful work of art at the Field Museum in Chicago with this famous quote of Charles Darwin: "The most beautiful and most wonderful forms on Earth." The American Naturalist covers all of them, the full diversity of life. It covers ecology, it covers evolution, it covers behavior and organismal biology with an evolutionary and ecological focus. Now, in its early days, the era that I'm going to be talking about, there was, and this will be interesting to you guys in particular, not very much botany in this journal. Botanists were publishing elsewhere for the most part. What we see in the American Naturalist, which we commonly call AmNat for shorthand, is what we call today animal physiology, animal morphology. Lots and lots of marine biology, quite a lot of paleontology, and a bit of anthropology that's less or virtually unrepresented in the journal today. And more generally, studies that were meant to understand the struggle for existence and how evolution shaped diversity on Earth. This came a little later, the focus, as I'll mention, on evolution, but this kind of natural diversity. Now, if you look at the journal today in 2021, you would see all these things with, as I say, with the exception of the anthropology and most of the paleontology. You'd still see this in the journal, but you'd see other things too. You'd see quite a lot of genetics. You'd see quite a lot of macroevolution and phylogenies. And you would see a huge amount of theoretical studies, of models, often papers that combine a theoretical and an empirical focus. Now, as a side note, this is what American Naturalist does not cover, which has come as a bit of a surprise to some people in the naturalist committee. Of course, naturalists are nudists. And there has been over the years a trickle of papers that have been submitted to the journal by people who think that it is the American Naturalist, which has always been a particular highlight of the years of the editors that have handled these papers. It's also no longer American. This is, of course, a historical artifact of when it was first formed. So this is what I want to talk about tonight. What was this journal like in its earliest years? It was founded in 1867. How did we track the women who published in it? Then I want to look at the first 3 women who published in the journal. They were very different women. They had very different roots into science and very different fates. Then I want to look a little more broadly. How did women enter science in this era? Were they able to persist? And when did things start to change from the view of women in science I'm going to present you with? And finally, I'll talk about some open questions that I'm left with from doing this project. So let me say I've published this work. It was published in 2018 in the journal, and I'm very happy to pass this article along to anyone who can't find it. It should be easily available. So what was the American Naturalist like in its early years? Where did it even come from? Well, the story goes back to Harvard in the 1860s. Soon after the Civil War, young men were coming back to the university, many with very, very strong interests in natural history and biology. The overwhelmingly powerful figure in biology at Harvard and really in America at this time was Louis Agassiz, who was French. He had kind of a dominant stranglehold on biology in these years. And he trained a lot of young men to go out and do science and to be the next generation of what we would now call naturalists. And these are 4 of the leading figures at this time. Well, these guys really hated Louis Agassiz, their advisor. They felt stifled by him. they wanted to do science the way they wanted to do science. And they basically broke away from their mentor and they decided to form a journal of their own. Now, eventually, you know, at first it was the journal that does not have Louis Agassiz in it, but eventually Agassiz published quite a lot in this journal. And it was referred to by the men who established it as a popular illustrated magazine. And it was founded in 1867. And if you look at the introductory editorial, you can get a sense of what this journal was meant to be. It was not a professional science journal. It was meant for scientists, but it was also for farmers and gardeners and artisans. It was a monthly address to all lovers of nature. And this quote in red, I think, is particularly interesting because it captures science at a very particular moment, right? This is less than 10 years after the publication of Origin of Species. And the jury was still really out, even among these highly trained, for the time, biologists. The origin of life and of specific forms, whether by direct creation or by secondary laws, as claimed by the followers of Lamarck or Darwin. So this was not initially founded as the journal that backs Darwin's way of thinking. The jury was still kind of out. Now, here's the kind of paper that was published. This would have been in the second year of its publication, a comical owl. The owl is called a solemn bird. It may be so, yet I have seen one in Cuba whose actions would upset the gravity of a very sober meeting. It's lovely prose. It's so different, of course, than what we see now. Quite a lot of good natural history in here. What the owl's, you know, the owl's species name, what his diet consisted of, how it swallowed. But you know, of course, it ends badly. He passed too near the cat when the worthless beast killed the funny bird. So you can get the sense of the popular nature of the American Naturalist while at the same time amount of science. Well, here's a picture that has turned up of the 1907 meeting of the society that published this journal. There was a society, the American Society of Naturalists, and there still is, that sponsors and supports this journal. And this is the 1907 meeting. And as hard as I look at this picture, I can't see any women, and presumably you can't either. And it raises an interesting question. In these early days of the society and the journal, was it really all men? Were there no women involved in this society? And so this is what Dan Bolnick and I started thinking about. And so we went back to the journal in its first 50 years of existence. And we decided to find every paper we could by a woman, see what it was about, and see how many there were. Now, I had been interested in this question a long time ago, and frankly, I thought it would not be possible to pull out every article by a woman because I figured that women were publishing with their initials to hide the fact that they were women. It turned out that that's not actually the case. The only authors we found that used initials were those four men that founded the journal. They used initials because everyone knew who they were. The women were publishing with their full names, so it really wasn't a problem. So for every article with a woman author or co-author, we recorded the topic of the paper, the general approach, you know, were there experiments involved, for instance, the conclusions, and whether any institutional affiliation was noted, whether she was associated with a museum, whether she was associated with a university. And then we kind of obsessively researched these women. We tried to find out everything we could about them. We did this, you know, with extensive use of the internet. There's also a couple of wonderful books. This classic book on women scientists in America by Margaret Rossiter. It's absolutely the classic. Another terrific book about women's colleges and the women who trained in Mount Holyoke, Smith, a couple of the other women's colleges. So what did we find? This was the broad pattern of the proportion of articles that were published by women from 1867 to 1916. They existed. right? A little less than 3% of the articles that were published in the journal in that time had a woman author. There was virtually no change over the 50 years that we were looking at. There were 77 articles published by 58 women. 88% of the articles had only one author. Now that's very, very different today. Almost, the vast majority of science articles have multiple authors. That really wasn't the case in this era. Most of the women published only once. And then, as I'll mention, we completely lose sight of them. We don't know what happened to them. There were a few, though, that were very prolific. Of course, they were publishing in other journals at the time as well, but they were coming back to this journal to publish. Almost all of them were American, although, as I'm going to mention, a lot of them trained in Europe. They did not get their higher education in the US. So who were these women? What were their stories? So what I'd like to do is talk about these first three women who published in the American Naturalist. They had very different routes into science and very different fates after the articles they published in this journal. So let me tell you a little bit about them. This is our first author, woman author who appears in AMNAT. She published one article in 1869. Who was Lucy Hart? Her husband had studied alongside the journal's founders at Harvard. So he was one of this kind of cabal of anti-Agassiz folks. And she accompanied him with her children to Brazil, where he was actually trying to find evidence for Noah's flood in the geological record, which is interesting in itself, right? So she went to Brazil with him, and she did a fair amount of natural history work while he was off looking at his rocks. She published one paper on the natural history of cuttlefish and one particularly endearing animal that grabbed her finger, and she wrote all about it. This was her only scientific contribution. She published one paper in her life, and it was this paper. Okay, what happened to Lucy Hart? Well, we know she left her husband and returned to the US. She said his decision to put geology first had cost him dearly. Basically, she packed up the kids and went home. He died of yellow fever soon thereafter at age 38 in Brazil. She actually paid to have his body sent back to the US where it was buried. She ran a girls' college prep school for the rest of her life. So she entered education, never published another work of science. Here's our second woman, quite different entry into science, different fate, Grace Anna Lewis. She was a real pioneer, fascinating woman. I don't believe a biography has ever been written of her, although there's some articles that have touched on her life. Pioneering scientist, also an abolitionist, suffragist, and temperance activist. She had very liberal parents. They believed that she should get a higher education. She was trained in Quaker schools in Philadelphia, very accomplished naturalist and a terrific scientific illustrator. Her career, she really wanted to be a scientist. She wanted to be an ornithologist. And her career was supported and promoted by an important ornithologist in Philadelphia. She worked with him, and he helped her publish what was volume one of what was going to be a long series of ornithology texts. So she got a great start in science. Well, what happened to Grace Anna Lewis? She published two articles in AMNAT, 1870 and 1871. One of them was on this lyre bird. Well, her patron died. Her patron actually died because he had arsenic poisoning from the fixatives he used to preserve bird skins at the museum, and died at a fairly young age. Once her patron had died, Grace Anna Lewis's access to the collections were curtailed. No one else supported her. She tried unsuccessfully to support her research and to land an academic position. She had no luck at all. She did not have a higher degree, and she was a woman, and this led her nowhere without an advocate. She took a teaching job at a girls' school in Philadelphia, and she never published again. So that was Grace Anna Lewis. Now, our third woman is quite different. This is Mrs. Treat, as she was known, Mary Lua Adelia Davis Treat. She published 5 articles in AmNat in this era. The work of Mary Treat began in collaboration with her husband, continued after they separated. She published her first article at age 39. She had a thriving scientific career. She published 76 articles and 5 books. She had a lively correspondence with Charles Darwin. He clearly respected her ideas, particularly regarding sex determination in butterflies. He disagreed with her, and he was correct. She wasn't. But he wrote quite a lot about Mrs. Treat and her ideas. So how was Mary Treat viewed in her time? How is she viewed now? Well, now she is quite well known, in part because Barbara Kingsolver just wrote a novel in which half the novel is in the voice of Mary Treat and her perspective on the natural world. Now, in her time, of course, she was viewed very differently. And she was viewed as, yes, she knew a huge amount about science, but the language she was talked about is maybe not surprising for the time. Her most prominent characteristic is a modesty so shrinking as to make any public recognition of her services painful to her, right? Modest lavishness, unwearied patience, which appears to be to her their only reward, right? So this is the view of, I think, many of the women that were engaged in science and natural history in the late 1800s. And I think one sees this particularly when it comes to women and their relationship to plants and to botany. Now, Mary Treat was actually an entomologist. She was not an etymologist, which is kind of amusing. She studied insects, but she was viewed through this view of women being attracted to the natural world and flowers of beauty and so on. But, you know, for all she was viewed in a very, you know, century specific way, Mary Treat very stubbornly carved out an amazing scientific career for herself for that time. Well, once we move beyond these 3 women, how did women enter science? Sort of more generally, how did they get in? Well, there's a few different ways. One way is they would have a powerful mentor, male mentor, and it was a male, right? Now, we just saw that with Grace Anna Lewis and her mentor and what happened when she lost him. There's a couple of, really 3 other mentors who come up again and again and again in this era, who mentored young women who were getting into science and staying into science. T.H. Morgan, still viewed as one of the all-time great geneticists, taught at Bryn Mawr for quite a portion of his career and taught women at that time. David Starr Jordan, who was the first president of Stanford University and one of my own academic great-great-great-grandfathers, and Edward Drinker Cope, who was instrumental in the journal, the American Naturalist, and one of the greatest geologists and paleontologists in American history. All of these men mentored a lot of women. And it's easy to think, well, they're the heroes of the story. It's like, thank God for these guys. Well, of course, the story is far more complicated once you start reading about these 3 men. David Starr Jordan's life has been documented in a lot of very painful detail. And I think instead I'll highlight Edward Drinker Cope. First of all, why did Cope want women to get higher education? He thought that women were not as smart as men. It's kind of counterintuitive. Women required extra education to get to the same point that men could get with less education. So he was trying to equalize the playing field by giving women graduate degrees. That's an interesting idea. He was also, I mean, like all of these women, you know, this is just such a great quote. No woman was safe within 5 miles of him. And the same story actually goes for all of these men who were mentors. Um, One could write a book just about that, right? Women entered science in a couple of other ways. Some of them collaborated. They collaborated with a husband, a brother, or a father. Susanna Phelps Gage, very respected anatomist who collaborated with her husband, published quite a lot, but the work was always known as his. Okay, we can't even find a photo of Susanna Phelps Gage. We can find her publications. We can find the family tomb. As a much more egalitarian couple were Rosa and Carl Eigenmann. These guys were pioneering ichthyologists. They described a lot of the fish fauna of the United States. If you know anything about fish taxonomy, there's a lot of species whose name epithet is Eigenmann and Eigenmann. Well, here are the Eigenmanns. They were a surprisingly egalitarian couple. They really shared science. They worked together their entire careers. Now, it's easy to say, well, egalitarian, that's good, that's great, right? Well, not all egalitarian couples were doing work that we can look back on and feel was great science. And I do have to mention these guys in this light. This is Gertrude and Charles Davenport. They were the parents of eugenics. And Gertrude Davenport in particular wrote some appalling articles, many of them published in the American Naturalist, that are straight out racism in the guise of its time as science. And it's really critical to not forget this fact. Women were very prominent in the eugenics movement in the United States. And the American Naturalist was one of the eugenics favored journals. And you go back to the journals in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, and there are shocking articles that are published in there, and quite a number of them are by women. There's a third route, which is they did what women do today. They went to graduate school. But the women of this era generally went to graduate school abroad because American graduate schools were not accepting women. But they were accepting women in Germany and Switzerland. There was a handful of universities, such as Heidelberg University, University of Zurich, that were training women in doctoral degrees. One woman that I'm particularly fond of in this light published one article in AmNat in 1891, Ida Hyde. She got her undergraduate degree at Cornell, went to Bryn Mawr, where she worked under T.H. Morgan, and then went to Heidelberg to get her PhD. Now, it was not easy for Ida Hyde. The barriers were set very, very high. Her professors at Heidelberg tried to flunk her out, but the male students in her cohort came to her defense and gave her extra help. They shared their notes with her when she wasn't allowed to sit in class and so on. She passed her doctoral exam at age 39 and went on to have a thriving career, as I'll mention a little later. Now, towards the very end of this period, women were going to graduate school in the United States. The key universities offering PhDs to women, well, the women's colleges, notably Bryn Mawr and Smith, and a couple of the public universities, particularly University of Illinois and then Cornell. Very, very long history of women in science. University of Cincinnati, University of Chicago, University of Texas, Michigan, Columbia University. We're granting women PhDs by the turn of the century. So by the late 1880s, women could enter science, right? But under what conditions could they stay in science? How many of them were able to get jobs and to stay in science? How did they persist? Well, over 50% of the women authors of this period, we found, published a paper in AmNat, either from their master's degree or PhD degree. This is clear from their acknowledgments in their paper, that the work came out of a master's degree at such and such a university, but then they disappear from the record. We were not able to trace what happened to them. They clearly left science, but we don't know why. We don't know if that was their choice. We don't know if they tried and failed. We don't know their stories. We would love to know their stories. Now, Many well-trained women published once or twice, but we know that constraints kept them from establishing their careers. There's the occasional woman that we know quite a lot of. One of the most interesting is Julia Platt. She published one article in 1899. She had gotten her PhD in 1898 in developmental biology. Very deeply trained, highly productive, published in many journals. She tried to obtain an academic position at a university. She failed to obtain any interviews, any jobs. And she was clearly heartbroken about this. She wrote, "Without work, life is not worth living." And she said, "If I cannot obtain the work I wish, then I must take up the second best." So what did Julia Platt go do? She moved to California and she became the mayor eventually of Pacific Grove, California, which is where Asilomar is, if any of you have been to Asilomar. And what Julia Platt did was she plowed her energy into conservation of Monterey Bay. And she's widely acknowledged as being the reason that Monterey Bay was saved, and that spectacular environment has been preserved. That was Julia Platt's next best. And it would be so amazing to know what she thought in looking back on her life at her decision to do what she did. Now, what many women did stay in science, but that doesn't mean they had an easy time of it. They toiled in the shadows until eventually they made a name for themselves. This is Mary Rathbun, another one of my favorites, published a series of articles in AmNat around 1900. She had no formal college education, but she was a crack taxonomist. She worked on crustacean taxonomy. She was an unpaid assistant to her brother, who was a curator at the Smithsonian. She worked for 28 years on her own on crustacean taxonomy. Finally, in I believe her 60s, she was promoted to the assistant curator of the collection. And upon retirement, she was awarded an honorary master's and PhD degree by the Smithsonian. Again, we see, her brother. If it wasn't for her brother, this wouldn't have happened. Lillian Morgan, she married her advisor. She married T.H. Morgan. She supported her husband and raised their kids for 20 years. She went back to research, but her husband, who, as I mentioned, was a great mentor of women, would not have women in his lab. He said, "There are 4 windows in my lab and a man for every window." So he was training them, but never really thought that they should have academic positions, right? So she worked with him, eventually did quite a lot of research on her own, but did not have a job. She followed him to California, where after he left Bryn Mawr. She, upon the death of her husband, was given her first paid position at age 76. And quite a lot of the work that is in genetics that's attributed to T.H. Morgan is thought to have actually been Lillian's. And then there are the ones who found a home in science. They were there. They were few and far between. This is Helen Dean King. She published one article in 1902, got her PhD in Bryn Mawr, advised by Morgan. She was employed by the Wistar Institute for 40 years. Helen King developed a genetically homogeneous rat that's the ancestor of about 50% of all the research rats today. And she was well acknowledged in her time as having been the pioneer in this field. Mary Caldwell, one of the first female department heads in the United States, and guess where? University of Arizona. She was the head of the Department of Microbiology in 1935. She got her bachelor's from U of A, PhD from Chicago. She returned home to Tucson because her husband became head of the zoology department at U of A and in 1933. And then 2 years later, she became the chair of the microbiology department. And I'm looking forward to doing more research. I think that's going to be a very, very interesting story about what women's experience in science was like specifically in Arizona. Her papers are at the Arizona Historical Society. I'm looking forward to taking a look at them. Now, these few successful women mentored younger women, and that smoothed their entry into science. So I mentioned Ida Hyde. Remember, she got her PhD in Heidelberg with the help of her cohort. Ida Hyde went on to found the physiology department at University of Kansas in 1890. She started a fund for women in science. It's still active at Kansas and still awarding money in her name. Mary Wilcox, another interesting character, she founded the zoology department at Wellesley in 1883. Of course, a women's college. She trained a generation of women PhDs. So did activities like this, is that sort of what spurred entry of women into ecology and evolution? And because of women mentoring women, do we see, an exponential increase of women in science? So that's sort of, my last question. When did things change? As I've said, the era of the 50 years I've been talking about, kind of nothing changed. When did it change? Well, not much changed for about another 30 years. Okay, so the women that were training women in this era, you don't see a signal of that for the next 30 years. But when things changed, and that was more like the 1950s, 1960s, it really changed to the point that at this point in the American Naturalist, over 60% of all articles have a woman co-author on them, and about 50% are first authored by women. So what happened? Well, we can't look at a journal to get an idea of what happened, because of course everything was changing in the United States in this era, and the world. Broad scale social trends that extended far beyond academia. What were some of these? Votes for women, right? Women coming into the workplace in association with replacing men who were at the front, professionalization of women's careers, and birth control. All of these were social changes that made it possible for women to get higher educations and to employ themselves and to succeed in a professional career. So what did we learn from all this? Well, the earliest women in our field, in the earliest days of our journal, were self-trained naturalists that frankly had a lot of leisure time. These were well-off women who could do this. By the late 1800s, women actually had more opportunities for higher education than you may have believed. In fact, at University of Chicago, about 2/3 of all botany doctoral degrees were being given to women. It's kind of amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite something. Like, what happened to them all? American Naturalist contributions of these women were generally master's or PhD work. But the problem was staying in science. They could get doctorates, they could not stay in science. The fates of women scientists in this period were tied, for better or worse, to the actions and the attitudes of powerful men. Women networked and they trained other women, and that, of course, is still the case. So we're left with a lot of open questions. First of all, what were the experiences of other poorly represented groups? They're much harder to get, right? We could do women because we can recognize a woman's name. What about ethnic minorities and religious minorities? We happen to know that Ida Hyde was Jewish, and she's very likely to be the first Jewish author in AmNat. We know who the first non-Western author in the journal was. It was Kei Mitsukuri, around 1900, first, to the point that, it was an American journal, but now it is a very international journal. And we finally, actually, after publishing this article in 2018, we've finally figured out who the first African-American author in AmNat was. It was Charles Henry Turner, an entomologist, published in the journal in 1899. And there's quite a lot that started to be written about Turner and his experiences. And there's, I believe, a new diversity award that's named after Turner. I think it's also critical to recognize that the women I've been talking about and for that matter, the men I've been talking about, all came from very, very privileged backgrounds. Okay. They were the ones for whom higher education or the leisure time to do natural history was even a conceivable thing. Now, that's not true anymore in science. If you start talking to scientists, you find how diverse their economic backgrounds actually are. When was it that less privileged individuals were able to get into the universities and to conceive of scientific careers? There's a lot to be written about this. Another question is, was women's science unique in any way? Did women do different kinds of science? Did they pursue different questions in science? Well, when I look at this, I mostly, my answer is women's science changed as science changed. Grace Anna Lewis's work, 1871, was very natural history focused. That's what science was like at the time. Lillian Morgan, publishing in AmNat in 1922, very heavy work on genetics. That's what science was doing at the time. My student Emily Jones and myself and our collaborator Regis Ferrier, publishing in the journal in 2009, super heavy theoretical work. That's what the journal publishes. So women's science changes as science changed, and AmNat changed, right? Here's, the range of the way the journal has described itself sort of under the title of the journal. It went from being a popular illustrated magazine to devoted to the natural sciences, to advancement of the biological sciences with special reference to the factors of evolution, lots and lots of genetics in the journal in those eras, the advancement and correlation of the biological sciences, devotion to the conceptual unification of the biological sciences. That's where we are today. And women's science changed along with it. Now, did women's experiences in publishing differ in any way? Did women have a harder time getting published? Were their articles rejected more often? I don't know. And I haven't yet figured out the right database to ask that question of. Peer review was not what we imagine today, was not the same in that era. And was the American experience typical? Different things were happening in different countries. The first woman certified in medicine in Paris was 1866, well before this era. Here's Marie Stopes, pioneering British paleobotanist. She got her PhD at University College London in 1902. I think it would be very interesting to do a comparison, an international comparison. And of course, these are all Western countries. What was going on in China? What was going on in Russia? I don't know. So, the past shapes the present and influences our science. And the stories shape who we are. And they've definitely shaped, who I am. My ancestors, this is the me at the tomb of Georges Cuvier, one of my ancestors, and David Starr Jordan, one of my illustrious but somewhat embarrassing ancestor. My mentors, both women, my graduate advisor, Beverly Rathke, Margaret Kidwell, who was the department head who supported my career here at Arizona. Here's me, my students who have always been female biased. We pass these legacies along. And in general, to the people who help us out. And that includes for this publication. First and foremost, I have a family that's enthusiastically supported my own life in science. My husband, Gagi Davidowitz, is a professor at Arizona. My son, Ilan Davidowitz. Dan Bolnick, my co-author and the current editor-in-chief of AmNat, and Trish Morse, the managing editor of the American Naturalist, who's been a huge supporter and enthusiast for this work. Trish has recently retired from this role, and I do believe she's on this call today. And hopefully she will be able to add lots of stories to what I'm talking about now. So I'd like to stop now and thank you very much for your interest in this work. I would love to think that it's a work in progress and that the search for new understanding continues about these amazing women and their lives and the other people who have struggled to make careers in science and natural history. And I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Judy. That was really great. It was really interesting to hear their stories. I'm so glad you did that research.
It was so much fun. I have to say, more fun than all the research I ever did on plant-animal interactions.
And I bet it was fun to read those articles.
It was.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.